Apologies if my voice sounds a bit rough. For whatever reason, my voice always sounds like this when I wake up in the morning. And I'm filming this video in the morning because before the kids wake up is the only time today I have to film this video. The rest of the day, I'm going to be busy working and taking care of the kids. I still have one kid sick, which means the wife is looking after the sick kid, and I have to look after the other one. So, you know how it goes, but I'm going to do my best to film this video. I'm continuing with my read through of the Bible, and I am now on the book of First Samuel. Now, I guess perhaps I should begin by talking about what is the book of First Samuel. There are two books of Samuel in the Bible, First Samuel and Second Samuel. Now, in the Jewish Bible, originally, these were just one continuous book. And the Jerusalem Bible, which I'm reading out of, you can see here, they emphasize the continuity of these books by just putting them next together. They don't even have a title page for the book of Second Samuel. We just continue from the end of First Samuel right into the book of Second Samuel. And perhaps there would be a reason for considering them as one whole, but I'm going to review them as two separate books, both just because of the weight of Christian tradition. This is how I grew up, and I'm sure how many of you grew up. And because there's just so much to talk about, it makes sense to divide them into two different books for the purposes of reviewing. Now, speaking of Samuel, the books of First and Second Samuel are the King David epic. They tell about the rise of young King David the rise of young David, and then the reign of King David. So I always thought as a kid that it was a misnomer to call them the books of First and Second Samuel, and I didn't even know this until I was an adult. But the reason that I as a kid, I just thought it was referred to as First and Second Samuel because Samuel is the initial character we meet, and I just thought, that they thought that whoever was editing these books said, okay, well, Samuel's the first character, so we'll just name the whole saga after him. But I didn't even know this until I was an adult. The reason that they're called First and Second Samuel, or the books of Samuel, is because of the Jewish tradition. So in the Jewish tradition, Samuel was responsible for writing these books, even though Samuel died fairly early on in the story, or about a quarter of the way through the story. Now, according to Robin Lane Fox, according to Jewish tradition, Samuel was gifted the gift of prophecy to foretell the events after his death. And in fact, if I'm remembering that right, Robin Lane Fox's Jewish tradition also credits Samuel with writing First and Second Kings under the gift of prophecy. Now, that's not the Christian tradition, so that's not the tradition I grew up with. So somebody let me know if I'm getting that wrong. In the Christian tradition, these books are just considered as anonymous. And in fact, I just learned this on Wikipedia just now. Originally in the Christian tradition, in the Catholic Vulgate Bible, it was referred to as First Kings, Second Kings, Third Kings, and Fourth Kings. So the book of Samuel was renamed as the book of First Kings. Second Samuel is the book of Second Kings, and then what we know as First Kings and Second Kings was Third Kings and Fourth Kings. But during the Protestant Reformation, there was a movement to go back to the original Jewish sources. And so the Protestant Bibles renamed these books as the books of Samuel, and eventually the Catholic Bibles followed suit. So I'm actually reading this out of the Jerusalem Bible, which is a Catholic Bible. It's not the Bible I grew up with, but it's the Bible I have now. But you can see that they've gone back to the Protestant tradition. And in the Jewish tradition, First and Second Samuel was just one book, the book of Samuel. It got split into two books with the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in the Roman period. And that's where the Christian tradition of splitting it up into two books comes from. Okay, is that all clear? Point is, despite being named First and Second Samuel, this is the King David saga. Now, when I was a young lad in Sunday school and going to my Christian schools, the King David saga was my favorite story in the whole Bible, and with good reason. I mean, there is a lot of juicy stuff in this story. It's really the only proper epic or saga in the Bible. I said that in a previous video, and I got some pushback on that. Some people said, well, what about Moses? And at the time I said, well, okay, yeah, sorry. That's an oversight on my part. Moses is also an epic. But now that I've been going through and rereading the Bible, I mean, sure, when you read the stories of Moses, there is the framework of an epic story there, but the details we get on Moses are a little bit light. There's not really like this in-depth storytelling, where when we get into the King David, we are getting a much more intimate picture of the main characters here. The storytelling is much more detailed. So in terms of it feeling like a saga or feeling like an epic, I think that this is the only true epic in the Old Testament. If you think I'm wrong, go ahead and debate me in the comments. Always happy to respond to those. And the narrative style here is much more akin to what we as moderns would expect as storytelling. And I mention that because when I was reviewing the book of Judges, I complained that there wasn't really much of a storytelling there. It was just a bunch of random events that happened with no connective tissue as to why things happened. Now, that's true to some extent in the book of Samuel. I mean, I don't want to say this is like there are still strange things that happen in the books of Samuel that don't really make sense, and there's some disjointed parts due to different sources being mashed together. I'll talk more about that later. But there is, nonetheless, much more of a storytelling element here, which was not in the book of Judges. So let me just read here from the book of Eli. Sorry, let me just read this section about the death of Eli to illustrate that we actually are getting some storytelling details here. So a Benjamite ran from the battle line, reaching Shiloh the same day, his clothes torn and dust on his head. See, these little details here are things that I appreciate more after having come through the book of Judges, where we would not have gotten those little details. When he arrived, Eli was there, sitting on his seat beside the gate, watching the road. Yeah, again, they're setting up the scene, giving descriptions. For his heart trembled for the ark of God. The man then came to the town, bringing the news, whereupon cries filled the town. Eli heard the uproar and asked, "What does this great outcry mean?" The man made haste and told Eli. Eli was 98 years old. His gaze was fixed. He was blind. The man said to Eli, "I have come from the camp. I escaped from the ranks today." "My son," said Eli, "what has happened?" The messenger replied, "Israel has fled before the Philistines. The army has been utterly routed. What is worse, your 2 sons are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backwards off his seat by the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was old and heavy. He had ruled Israel for 40 years. Okay, now, from a modern perspective, yes, there are some storytelling details there that are lacking, but it's it's much more approaching our expectations of what a story would look like or feel like, I guess, with the narration and a lot of interesting details in there. And so that makes this section a lot more, feel a lot more like literature when you're reading it, and a lot more pleasant to read, a lot more interesting to read than other sections of the Bible. So I thoroughly enjoyed my reread of this section. Now, like I said, this was always my favorite part of the Bible in Sunday school. But you know, if you grow up in Sunday school, and I suspect many of you will have these memories, you're so used to hearing these stories retold both by Sunday school teachers and children's Bibles and comic books, the Pix comic books, if anybody remembers those growing up from Sunday school. This was made into, I don't know how many cartoons, which I saw as a child. If you grew up in Christian circles, I'm sure you saw cartoons of King David. And so, you know, our collective memory of the King David story comes as much from this other media as it does from the actual scripture itself. And so when you read the scripture, it's interesting to remember what is in there and what is not in there. For example, in my mind, I had somehow remembered or somehow pictured David being in Saul's court for a much longer period than he was. I had imagined Saul just gradually turning against David. Instead of it happening quite suddenly, there's David and Goliath, and then almost immediately Saul becomes jealous of David. And I think that memory, well, some of that may have just been because it's been so long since I reread it. Some of that may have been just my own misrememberings, but I think some of that own memory is, some of that misremembering is just remembering the media surrounding the David and Saul story rather than the actual scriptures. But yeah, again, let me know what your memory of this is. But again, to return to what I was saying, I always thought as a kid this was such an epic story. All the various adventures David goes through, David's relationship with Saul, the twists and turns that David's relationship with Saul takes. I used to think as a kid, wouldn't it be great? Someone would do like a epic TV show chronicling the whole of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the whole King David story. You would start it out with Samuel, because that's the way the Bible does it. From Samuel, you pass up to Saul, the rise and fall of Saul, young King David. And actually, since I was a kid, there actually have been a couple attempts to turn this into a TV show, and neither of them have succeeded. They both ended up getting canceled before they truly got off. I reviewed one of those attempts on this channel, and I'll link to that review in the description down below. So it hasn't really succeeded yet, unless there's an adaptation I'm unaware of, in which case let me know in the comments. But perhaps it could still succeed one day, although rereading this, I can see where the difficulties in adapting this are. So it might need some translation for a modern audience or some adjustment, and we'll talk about those as we go through them. But I guess one final preliminary note before we get into this is maybe let's talk briefly about the historicity of this. So, excuse me. I've been going through, when I talked about Exodus or when I talked about the conquest of Canaan, and I've been saying frequently that as I've been reviewing the Bible, this is not historical. The archaeological evidence doesn't support this. But of course, that does not mean that the whole Bible is not historical, right? I mean, there definitely was a nation of Israel. There definitely was a Babylonian captivity. So some stuff actually happened. And Robin Lane Fox said in his book, the unauthorized version, Truth and Fiction of the Bible, Truth and Fiction in the Bible, that the key event is the fall of Jerusalem. And that definitely happened, and that was around the time, or a generation after that time, that the Bible was edited together. So he says, as a rough rule of thumb, the fall of Jerusalem is the most historically accurate part of the Bible, of the Old Testament narrative. And then the further back in time you go, the less accurate it is, until you get to the completely mythical sections. So if that's our rough framework here, then the King David story falls into that maybe historical period. It may be historical. We may be getting into the historical era. Robin Lane Fox himself argues that 2 Samuel, which talks about the reign of King David, is historical, and in fact probably based on eyewitness documents. Now, he is a proper scholar himself, and he is not a Christian, he is an atheist. But I was somewhat confused when I was reading his book, because he doesn't really give a good argument for it, in my opinion. His argument seems to be, it must be historical because it feels historical. It doesn't feel mythical. It just feels like an actual historical chronicle. And that seems like a rather weak argument to me. But I've noticed since then that this assumption seems to be seems to be commonly shared by a lot of other scholars, that perhaps the 2 Samuel, what is known as the court history of King David, is historical and based on eyewitness testimony. And in fact, the Jerusalem Bible also says that here in their introduction to this historical section. So the history of David's family and the disputed succession includes much eyewitness material, which goes back to the time of his son Solomon. But they don't do any of the legwork to prove that this is eyewitness material. And there are some people who are critical of the fact that the King David is a historical figure. On BookTube, Steve Donahue among them. I once asked him one of his Q&A's sections what he thought about the historical King David and what he thought about Robin Lane Fox's argument that King David was the court history was based on eyewitness documents, and he said no, a completely mythological figure, no historical basis at all. So, make of that what you will. Maybe 2 Samuel is historical, maybe it's not. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because this is really a discussion I should have when I get around to reading and reviewing the book of 2 Samuel. I'm still on 1 Samuel. So Robin Lane Fox says, although he thinks the court history of 2 Samuel is based on eyewitness material, 1 Samuel is later day mythologizing, or legends from a later period. And his argument is it just feels too much like a legend, like too much of a once and future king type story. King David being God's special anointed, doing all these amazing, miraculous feats, having all these adventures, which is a contrast to the tone of 2 Samuel, where we see a much more kind of flawed king who has much more mundane events, or maybe more realistic events, like rebellions in the kingdom, a succession crisis, things that seem more historical. Now, again, the argument here maybe is just a little bit weaker. It's Second Samuel is historical, not because of any evidence we have, no archaeological evidence, no corroborating evidence, but Second Samuel is historical just because it seems to feel historical. First Samuel is not historical just because it feels mythological or feels legendary. But again, even though that seems like a little bit of a weak argument, I've noticed that this seems to be fairly widespread amidst the other stuff I've read in the Bible. So maybe that's our working assumption then. This is the legendary beginnings of King David before we get to 2 Samuel, which may or may not be historical. Now, Robin Lane Fox doesn't mention this, but one argument for the fact that this is legendary is David and Goliath, where we meet Goliath, who is described. Where is David Goliath described? Yeah. So Goliath from Gath, he was 6 feet tall. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. So Goliath from Gath, 6 feet tall, shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, near the end of 2 Samuel, we actually see another Goliath of Gath. Who was killed not by David, but by one of David's men. So again, war with the Philistines broke up at Gob, and Alahan, son of Jar from Bethlehem, killed Goliath of Gath, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. So the exact same name, the exact same description of his spear, killed by one of David's men, not David himself. So one of the explanations I've read on the internet for this is that this was the original story, but this guy here, Elhanan, son of Jar, nobody knows who he is. He doesn't really appear as a major figure in the Bible. So eventually the story of the slaying of Goliath had to be moved over to a major hero, and that's where it got moved over to the King David story. So that's evidence of later day mythologizing and various other events being moved over to King David. Now, the other thing about this narrative, which has been pointed out by numerous commentators, is that everything happens twice. At least from the introduction of Saul. So the beginnings with Samuel, I don't believe, has as much repetition. But once we get to the introduction of Saul, so Saul is anointed king twice. Saul loses God's favor twice. David comes before Saul twice. Saul attempts to kill David twice, loses his temper, or an evil spirit comes on him and throws a spear at David. David hunts Saul, and David spares Saul's life twice. David comes before the Philistines twice. It's... I mean, what's going on here... Sorry, let me back up. The way this was often presented to me in Sunday school, and perhaps the way it was presented to you in Sunday school, is it really did happen twice. The first time Saul threw his spear and tried to kill David, they made up. And Saul says, okay, I'm sorry, I'm not going to throw my spear at you again. This isn't all in the text, but this is explanation that's added in Sunday school. And then after Saul threw his spear at David the second time, then David said, okay, there's no making up with this guy, and I'm going to flee his castle, his court. And so on through the rest of this. So when David spares Saul's life twice, it really did just happen twice, etc. If you grew up in a conservative Christian setting, that's the explanation you're given for this, and that works for some of it. it works less well for other parts of it. So the one of the classic cases is where David comes before Saul. So there are two different accounts. In 1 Samuel 16, David takes service with Saul. So Saul went to Jesse saying, let David take my service. He has won my favor. And then we get the David and Goliath story, which is another story about how David comes before Saul. And it's very difficult to reconcile this because when David is come before Saul, Saul asked him, whose son are you, young man? David replied, the servant of Jesse of Bethlehem. So Saul has no idea who David is in this second story. Now, what's going on here, obviously, is that there are different sources that are being put together. Whoever edited this Bible had access to multiple versions of the story. And perhaps nowadays, in today's culture of continuity or whatever, what an editor would have done is tried to make one coherent story out of these different accounts. But for whatever reason, the editor of the Bible decided that both accounts were worth preserving, so he put them together side by side. Which of course leads to a lot of contradictions, which is ample fodder for Christopher Hitchens and the other atheists. I must admit, during my deconversion days, I harped on this a lot myself. But it's important to keep in mind that this is not an accident. Whoever edited the Bible did this by design. So it's not like, how stupid this is, that they don't even know that this part contradicts the earlier part. They knew. Whoever edited it together knew. And so you have to read this with that intent in mind. I'm going off of now what I learned from the History of World Literature from the Great Courses series, where the lecturer Grant Vaught has a lecture talking about the Old Testament. And he points out that in these two different versions of David coming before Saul, there's one version in which David is completely passive. So God is just moving everything so that David comes before Saul. So Saul is tormented by an evil spirit. Saul complains that he needs help. One of the soldiers spoke up. There's a son of Jesse who's a skilled player, and he's brought before Saul and wins Saul's favor. And David doesn't do anything during this. This is just all events happening to David, or I guess maybe this is presumably God causing events to happen. But then in the second event here, David and Goliath, we have David being very active. So he's going to the Israeli army to meet his brothers, and he's bringing them food, and he sees Goliath, and David gets really mad that Goliath is defying the Israelites, and he starts shooting his mouth off about how he is going to teach Goliath a lesson, and everybody is saying to him, "Who are you? You're just a kid." But David, by his own initiative, goes out and slays the giant himself. And Grant Vaught points out that these two conflicting accounts, one in which David is actively making his own destiny, and one in which destiny is just happening to David, are side by side here, and you get to choose the account which best fits your own worldview, or maybe which fits the way you want this narrative to happen. So it's almost like you remember those choose your own adventure books. It's like you get to choose your own story. Here are two different accounts with different themes. Which themes are most appealing to you? God moving things to make history happening, or people taking their own destiny into their own hands? And now that's Grant Vaught may be guilty of a little bit of cherry picking here, because that's the most obvious example of completely different themes. And some of these other repetitions, perhaps the thematic difference is a little less obvious, or is it? Maybe I'm just missing it. But yeah, that's what we've got here. Okay, now 30 minutes into this review, let me finally back up and take a view of what actually happens in this book. And I'm just going to go over the headings in my Jerusalem Bible, because that's probably the best way to do this. So first we have the story of Samuel, the childhood of Samuel, the ark in the Philistine hands, which is a little bit, it's one of the interesting little bizarre stories which is in this saga. One of the reasons maybe why this saga was so interesting to me when I was a kid, and to a lot of people. The Philistines actually capture the ark of the Israelites, because the Israelites bring the ark into battle with them without God's sanction. And while I'm going through here, I'm just going to linger briefly on this little passage here, the death of the wife of Phinehas. So Phinehas is one of the two sons of Eli. Eli is the high priest who is raising Samuel. And it says his two sons were killed when they took the ark into battle. And it says, now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, this is the daughter-in-law of Eli, the wife of Phinehas was with child and near her time. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and husband were dead, she crouched down and gave birth, for her labor pains came on. When she was at the point of death, the women standing around her said, do not be afraid, you have given birth to a son. But she did not answer and took no notice. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has gone from Israel, thinking of her father-in-law and husband and the capture of the ark of God. And she said, the glory has gone from Israel because the ark of God has been captured. Now, that seems to be the origin story for a character who's going to go on to be some importance in the story, right? That would be the narrative expectations we would have from this little detour to talk about how this child was born. But Ichabod does not have any adventures that are chronicled in the rest of the Bible. But I was intrigued enough by this. I looked him up on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia says there is some speculation that during the time of Samuel, Ichabod might have been a major character. And evidence for that, I guess, is not only that his birth seems to be described in some detail, as if, we've got to talk about how this figure was born. But then later on, and I think I forgot to mark the place, but then later on when the high priest is named, is mentioned in the Bible, later on in the story, they refer to him as the brother of Ichabod. Here we go. Ahijah, son of Ahitub, brother of Ichabod, son of Phinehas, son of Eli. Ahijah, the high priest, whenever he's referred to, is referred to as the brother of Ichabod. So why, which they don't usually do, right? They usually say it's the son of so-and-so, not the brother of anybody. So why are they saying it's the brother of Ichabod? Because presumably Ichabod was a major figure and he had his own adventures and he had his own legends. And that's all been lost to history. So we have the story about how he was born, and we have his name being dropped a few times, but all Ichabod's adventures are gone. Presumably. I mean, this is all speculation. But that's the kind of thing maybe to keep in the back of your head when you're reading this. When there are stories that don't seem to go anywhere, or stories that seem to allude to stuff but then don't explain it, that's perhaps because we're just missing the rest of the story. And yeah, what we wouldn't give to have all these stories that were lost. But yeah, so presumably at one time the narrative was a lot richer, and whoever edited the Bible together was drawing on a lot of different sources. Okay, then we get to Samuel and Saul and the institution of the monarchy. Now, what I pointed out when I was reviewing the book of Judges, which had both sections which were pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy, is something that I learned from Christine Hayes' lectures at Yale Open University, which is there is a pro-monarchy tradition and an anti-monarchy tradition that were edited both into the Bible. So we get sources saying we really need a king, and we get sources saying kings are the worst, you don't want kings. The Jerusalem Bible also makes this note, and they even go as far as to say which chapters come from which source. So there's an anti-royalist source in chapter 8, chapters 10, verses 17 to 24, and chapter 12. Now, it seems a little bit strange to have a chapter split right in half, but I guess what you have to remember is the chapters and verses were added in later. So the original writer of this book, or the original editor of this book, was not putting in the chapters and verses. That's something that I don't know when the chapters and verses got added in, actually, but that's that's something later editors of the Bible did. Anyways, the Royalist version is chapters 9 to 10, 16, and chapter 11. Now, Wikipedia actually calls this the Republican source. Christine Hayes in the Jerusalem Bible call it the anti-royalist source, or the anti-monarchical source. So I don't know where Wikipedia is getting the Republican source from. It's definitely anti-monarchical, anti-king. Does that mean it's Republican? Well, let's just read this together, maybe. The disadvantages of the monarchy. All that Yahweh had said, Samuel repeated to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the rights of the king who is to reign over you. He will take your sons and assign them to his chariotry and cavalry, and they will run in front of his chariot. He will use them as leaders of 1,000 and leaders of 50. He will make them plow his plowland and harvest his harvest, and make his weapons of war and gear for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your field, of your vineyards and olive groves, and give them to his officials. He will tithe your crops and vineyards to provide for his eunuch and his officials. He will take the best of your manservants and maidservants, of your cattle and your donkey, and make them work for him. He will tithe your flock, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out on account of the king you have chosen for yourselves. But on that day, God will not answer you." So, I think this is some pretty powerful anti-monarchical rhetoric, right? You don't want a king. A king's not going to help you. You are going to help the king. You are going to become the slaves of the king. He is going to screw you over. He's going to take all your best stuff. He's going to give it to all his officials, his little cronies, his little power base, and he's just going to make you his slaves. So I don't know. I thought this was interesting to remember. Sometimes we have this view of history as before the Enlightenment or before the French Revolution, everybody believed in the divine right of kings and that kings were the natural way. And we sometimes forget, I mean, we know it, but we sometimes forget about the democratic and republican traditions in the ancient world. Um, and, this was edited together around the 4th century. That's when democratic Athens was at its most radical, right? Was there any cross pollination or any cross ideas between democratic Athens and the writers of the Bible, or what was this just an idea that naturally just occurs to people? Which is Noam Chomsky's view that people don't need to be told that they're being screwed over by the kings; they can see it with their own eyes. But yeah, just an interesting reminder of the anti-ruling class sentiment that even existed here in the ancient world before Marx, before Bakunin, before Kropotkin, the idea that the government is going to make you their slaves. But, of course, that is side by side with a pro-royalist source. Where is it? Let me see if... I'm not sure if I can find the exact verse here. But just a couple chapters later, God tells Samuel, you need to anoint a king because my people are getting oppressed by their enemies. So we need a king to save them. Yeah. So Yahweh had given Samuel a revelation to the day before Saul came, saying, about this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. You are to anoint him as prince over my people Israel, and he will save my people from the power of the Philistines. For I have seen the distress of my people, and their crying has come to me. So here God is seeing the distress of his people, and God says, okay, I will get a king to deliver them to the people. Here, the people are asking for a king in violation of what God wants. But God, when the people refuse to listen, then God relents and gives them the king. So again, two different versions side by side, one pro-monarchy, one anti-monarchy. Now, the figure of Saul is a very interesting figure because he's David's antagonist, or at least the antagonist of the young David before David becomes king. But he's not a purely evil guy. In fact, there's an element of Greek tragedy to him. He starts out as a really good guy, and he's described as handsome and humble and brave and a really good king, going out and saving the people. But then he loses God's favor, and he eventually kind of descends into madness and becomes a tyrant who's chasing David. Although even near the end, the narrator makes it quite obvious that there is still some good left in Saul. So you can see where, again, the idea of making this into an epic TV series, like the rise and fall of Saul starts out as a really good guy and then gradually gets corrupted by the institutions of his office and becomes evil, or becomes at least compromised. But that narrative is actually not quite in the actual text itself. So to get that story we'd want if we were filming this for a TV show or something, we would have to massage the narrative a little bit. So, for example, there are two versions of why Samuel breaks with Saul, or why Saul loses God's favor. And they're different, but in both versions, Saul is not doing anything that we would accept as inherently evil or wicked. God has given him certain commands for somewhat arbitrary reasons, or at least it seems to us like that. And Saul is not following these arbitrary rules. In other words, Yahweh is saying jump, and when Yahweh says jump, you better jump. And Saul is not jumping when Yahweh commands it. So it's a failure of religious piety, but in terms of like the human element of it, it doesn't have the satisfying narrative arc of what we would expect in a modern story of Saul being turned into a wicked man, or Saul being corrupted over time. So the first one is there's the Philistine army is amassing against Israel. Saul has all his army out, and he's ready to do battle against the Philistines, but he needs to wait for Samuel to make the sacrifice. And Samuel is late in coming, and the men are beginning to panic, and they're beginning to disperse. And so Saul says, okay, I'll just make the sacrifice myself. And it seems to be something perfectly reasonable. I mean, interestingly enough, even from the narration that we're given here in the Bible, it's kind of setting Saul up. It's setting this up to be the reasonable choice. Saul says, I saw my army deserting me and dispersing, and you had not come at the fixed time when the Philistines were mustering. I mean, I guess it's an open question in the context of this narration, how much of Saul's description here is self-serving and how much of this is what was actually happening. Well, actually, no, I take that back. In the very previous verse, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the army deserting Saul was dispersed. Okay, I guess that is actually happening. Sorry, I was going to say that was just Saul's explanation of it, but yeah, just a couple of verses previously, it backs up what Saul is saying. So, anyways, but Samuel says, you have acted like a fool. If you had carried out the order Yahweh your God commanded you, Yahweh would have confirmed your sovereignty over Israel forever. But now your sovereignty will not last, blah, 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 blah. So, it's not like, again, from a modern perspective, there's no moral decline of Saul. He just didn't do exactly what Yahweh told him to. But, from a modern perspective, kind of waiting for Samuel to make the sacrifice versus making the sacrifice yourself because your army is in trouble. A little bit hard to fault Saul for that too much. And then the second explanation of why Saul uses Yahweh's favor is because he doesn't destroy all the Amalekites like he's ordered to. Robin Lane Fox points out the interesting irony that later on in the biblical narrative, when we get to King Ahab is going to be condemned by the prophet Elijah or Elisha, I forget which one, because he let the king live after a battle when he was commanded to kill everybody. And Saul makes a similar mistake. He's supposed to kill all the Amalekites, but he lets one of them live. And he also keeps some of the sheep and cattle, the best ones for him and his men, which, is a little bit self-serving. But again, from a modern perspective, it's difficult to see who he's really harming here by not destroying everything. other than the fact that God commanded him to destroy everything, and when God says jump, you better jump. Um, so yeah, that's the second reason of him losing God's favor. But the narration does not show him as turning into an evil man. He's just somebody who didn't follow the letter of God's command exactly. And so then Samuel kills the king of the Amalekites himself. Now, I don't know if I've got time for a brief digression here, but the whole thing about the Amalekites is interesting. According to the biblical narrative, when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, I think early on in the book of Exodus, or midway through the book of Exodus, they get attacked by the Amalekites, who just kind of ambushed them. And then throughout the whole rest of the biblical narrative, the Amalekites have to be repaid for what they do. So Saul has to make a holy war against the Amalekites. Sorry, I know my hand's shaking a little bit here. Try and steady the camera. And Yahweh Sabaoth says, I will repay what Amalek did to Israel when they opposed them on the road by which they came out of Egypt. So it's a little bit different maybe than the conquest of Canaan. Conquest of Canaan, the Canaanites are exterminated, but I guess the reason is they're living in the promised land and we want the Israelites to take that land. Here, the extermination of the Amalekites are not in the promised land, right? They're just people who need to be exterminated. It's a little bit hard to tell from the biblical narrative exactly when they get exterminated, because there are different descriptions of them being wiped out, but then they pop up later. And in fact, they're going to pop up near the end of 1 Samuel, when the Amalekites raid David's camp and take all the sons and daughters captive. But what's interesting about this to me is if you look up the Amalekites on Wikipedia, nobody really even knows for sure whether they actually existed or not. Outside of the biblical narrative, we don't have any archaeological evidence for them. We don't have any evidence for the Amalekites being mentioned in any other ancient sources. So they appear to be completely mythological, which, raises the question of where and why did this myth come from, of these people who needed to be exterminated because they had attacked Israel on the road out of Exodus. It's just another fascinating little question, or another rabbit hole we can go down. But look at the time. I spent 52 minutes. I haven't even gotten to David, and the David narrative is what's most interesting. Okay, so actually, another little detour. There's a little mini story here in 1 Samuel 14 about the heroic deeds of Jonathan, where Jonathan and just his armor bearer attacked the Philistine army all by themselves and ended up defeating them. So I don't know. I just thought this was a little interesting narrative here that's inserted in here, which again is what makes this section of the Bible so fascinating. And there are all these little interesting stories. So this is just a little digression we get about Saul's son Jonathan, who of course is going to go on to form a very strong bond with David. But then David shows up in 1 Samuel 16, and David goes through 4 different stages in the book of 1 Samuel, which again, I'll use the Jerusalem Bible to highlight the headings here to help. There's David at court. So David as a member of Saul's court. And then after Saul tries to kill him twice, the flight of David. And then David ends up becoming an outlaw, the leader of a group of outlaw, where he goes around it's, I think it's presented, where is it presented? Sorry, I'm trying to find the verse I'm looking for. Talks about David has set up his own camp, and all the people come. Lots of people come and join him, and he becomes like this judge who helps arbitrate between Israel and stuff like that. So I guess maybe kind of a Robin Hood figure. Although, like a lot of outlaws, he can also be vindictive, which is the story of Nabal and Abigail. So David asks Nabal for some donations. I mean, this seems like a mafia boss kind of pressing for protection money, or an outlaw asking for donations. But according to the footnotes here in the Jerusalem Bible, this is just, I guess, customary hospitality in this culture. David's a nomad, and so Nabal owes him hospitality. Nabal refuses to give the hospitality, so David puts on his sword, and he is going to go slaughter all of Nabal's family. Now, Nabal's wife, Abigail, goes out to intervene, but David says that if Abigail had not come out, I would not have left one male left alive by morning. So, a bit of a Robin Hood type outlaw, but also a bit of a maybe predatory type outlaw as well. Saul is intermediately pursuing David during this time, although David spares him twice, with two different versions of Saul being asleep and David sparing him. And in both of these versions, we see that Saul is not completely evil. Saul is filled with remorse. He weeps aloud. He acknowledges that David is a more upright man than him. Saul is... I mean, it's interesting. Usually in the Old Testament narratives, the kings become bad because they stop worshiping Yahweh and start worshiping other gods. In the case of Saul, though, he never stops worshiping Yahweh. He's always trying to win back Yahweh's favor. So it's not like the other gods that we're going to meet in it's not like the other kings who we're going to meet in 1st and 2nd Kings, where they are turning to other gods. Saul is forever trying to get back God's favor, but God has turned to another king. An interesting twist on the familiar story. I mean, the other thing about Saul is, and again, this is where this is less appealing from a modern storytelling point of view. When Saul tries to kill David, it's not because of like a human thing, like he gets corrupted by jealousy. Well, I mean, he does get corrupted by jealousy, but it's always like an evil spirit from Yahweh came on Saul. I mean, again, if I was telling this story, if I was filming this as a TV miniseries or a TV epic, I think it would be more appealing for Saul himself to get gradually corrupted by his lust for power and by his jealousy and stuff like that. But in the biblical narrative, it's just like, nope, evil spirit comes on you, suddenly you turn homicidal, rather than the character naturally developing that way himself. So not the way I would have told the story, but of course, this is the Bible, so the emphasis is on God making things happen or not happen. And then David goes to the Philistines. Now, there's actually two different versions of David going to the Philistines. The first one happens way back here. David is in the territory of the Philistines hiding out, and he gets brought before the king, and David just pretends to be a madman, and that gets him off. And I suspect, there's no footnotes here, but I suspect these are, again, two different versions of a similar story because of different source materials. Although I don't know, maybe they're from the same source material and he just goes to the Philistines twice. I've been rambling on for about an hour, and my camera is going to cut off on me anytime. So just a little bit of a warning. I may just get suddenly cut off here. I'm going to keep talking, though, and apologies as always for not having organized my thoughts better, so I just ramble on for so long. But then, and I'll just get cut off whenever I get cut off, I guess. The next part is the next time that David goes to the Philistines is at the end of 1 Samuel, David among the Philistines. So again, David is hiding out for Saul, and he goes over to the Philistines, and his little band is staying with the Philistines, and they're raiding the neighboring territories for food and supplies. And again, just a sign that this is a little bit difficult to translate to a modern audience. So David and his men went on raids against the Gershonites, Gizrites, and Amalekites. For these are the here's the Amalekites again. For these are the tribes inhabiting the region that goes from Telam in the direction of Shur as far as the land of Egypt. So I guess south of Philistine. Now every time they go out, David laid the countryside waste and left neither man nor woman alive, but took the sheep and oxen, donkeys, camels, and garments, and came back, bringing them to Achish. Achish is the king of the Philistines. And then he tells Achish he's been out raiding the Israelites, but actually he's been out raiding these other people, and he just makes sure he kills every man, woman, and child, so there's nobody left alive as witnesses to say otherwise. Now, again, this probably didn't happen because this is probably a mythological story, but again, you can see where a modern audience would have problems with that narrative, especially after maybe the horrors of the 20th century. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that, because even before the 20th century, people like Thomas Paine were having problems with these narratives. But yeah, that's the... And it's a little bit ambiguous, or maybe it's a lot ambiguous, how we're meant to feel about this in the text, because this is not sanctioned by Yahweh in this case. So sometimes Yahweh says, okay, you need to go out and kill everybody and leave nobody alive. I mean, that's what got Saul in trouble earlier in the campaign against the Amalekites. Yahweh had told him to kill everyone and leave no one alive. Here, David is just doing it on his own initiative. So how are we meant to feel about that? And then one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament, just because it's so bizarre, is Saul and the witch of Endor. Now, as a kid, of course, I heard Endor, and I thought, the Endor moon from Return of the Jedi. It's called Endor, right? I'm not misremembering that. Which I have half wonder if that's where George Lucas got the name from, or maybe where he subconsciously got the name from. I don't know. But Witch of Endor, which is very interesting and causes no lack of problems for Christian theologians, because it shows Saul is consulting a witch. The Jerusalem Bible translates it as a necromancer, somebody who can bring back the dead. And so they bring up Samuel's ghost. Now, Christian theology